for joining me today on this short course where I will be speaking about how to support visually impaired pupils, staff and families in your education settings. My name's Kate Holden and I'm a specialist teacher working for a charity called the Together Trust based in Stockport. I have the huge privilege of supporting education settings and at times some businesses and other organisations as well. And I work mainly in the areas of autism and social, emotional and mental health. What I do in schools is direct work with students with autism, and I provide training and consultancy for staff. Today, however, I'm not here to talk about those things. I'm here to speak about supporting people with visual impairment in education settings, so pupils, staff and families. So when I work with autistic people, of course I've done the training and I've read the research, and I read the books, I'm always on the internet. But to me, I've always learnt most from the autistic people I support and in working in that partnership together to find, ways forward. So our approach at Together Trust is very bespoke and we always start with the individual. So that's why much of what I'm going to say today in this talk comes from my own experiences and those of visually impaired people around me who are close to me. I've got many, many friends who are visually impaired or registered blind. So in my late 20s, while I was working as a primary school teacher, my sight started to deteriorate quite quickly due to a condition called keratoconus, which affects the corneas. I was diagnosed late teens, but mine progressed quite rapidly. And then following on from that, I needed new corneas. So corneal transplant surgery can take a couple of years. So during that time, I was registered blind. So I've got that lived experience of returning to work as a visually impaired member of staff in a teaching school and all of that entailed. I haven't got time obviously to go into that in detail and those experiences, but I have put a couple of web links in the notes for you. There's an interview on YouTube with Dr. Pookie Knight-Smith and a blog that I wrote for Welfare Educators about that experience. I've also got lived experience from a parental perspective as well, as my husband is registered blind and he's accompanied everywhere by his guide dog, Kane. So you'll see him a little bit later on. I'm going to talk about how schools therefore can support families as well as the staff and the students. So there are loads of terms to describe sight loss or loss of vision, and there's no universally accepted terminology. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to use the terminology which I most relate to, which is visual impairment. There are others who are going to prefer or use another term. So my advice would just be ask what people prefer and what they're comfortable with. So just for some figures, in the UK, there's about 2 million people living with sight loss, and of these, around 360,000 are registered as severely sight impaired, which was previously known as blind, or sight impaired, which was previously known as partially sighted. And the RNIB estimates that around 25,000 children and young people up to the age of 16 in England and Wales have a vision impairment. And that's of sufficient severity to need specialist educational support. As many as 50% have additional disabilities or needs as well, including some young people who have very complex needs. And then of the children in the UK with a visual impairment, quite a lot of them are in mainstream education. And the figure at the moment is about 2/3. And some of those settings will have a specialist unit, but they'll certainly have some kind of specialist support coming into school. And then about 1/3 of young people with visual impairment attend specialist settings. And then unfortunately in the UK, it is a bit of a postcode lottery as to what support's available. And there is a lot of variation between local authorities. There's no standard threshold for receiving support from a local authority visual impairment service. So we've seen that variance in provision is really increasing with these public sector cuts that we've had over the last few years. So much of the support for some people with a visual impairment will come from whatever's in their area. So it will be local charities, it will be visual rehabilitation centres if they exist in their area. So I guess that's why it's even more important than ever that we develop our own knowledge in this area and that we have some key skills and tips at our disposal that we can use to support people. So during this talk, like I do with autism, I'll be giving just some general tips to support people with a visual impairment, and they are general. Any form of sight loss is going to differ amongst people enormously, even if they're diagnosed with the same condition. So the main functional effects of visual impairment are going to include maybe central or peripheral vision loss, poor image sharpness, that blurring, low contrast sensitivity or adaptability to light, and impaired eye movement or colour loss. So not all visual impairment is the same, there's different degrees of severity. So it's just good practice to work carefully with specialists, with families, and of course the individuals themselves who know themselves better than anybody else to adapt the tips and strategies that I'm going to give. Make them suit the individuals you know. If you'd like to take a look at what different forms of sight loss can look like, there are various free simulators online. So I've added a web link to one of these that you might want to have a go at and try out. And these are brilliant for staff training as well. And what the simulator does is it allows you to put in a location or a postcode of a place that you're familiar with. You'll see a picture of that place on the screen, and then you can click on different sight conditions to see what that place would look like through the eyes of somebody with that condition. And you can also alter the severity of it as well. The RNIB do have glasses that you can buy and try on, and that will allow you to actually walk around and experience what sight loss might look like or be like for you, but they are quite expensive. So as an alternative, the sight simulator is a good one. So next, I'm going to move on to how we can support students in school with a visual impairment. So I'm going to move on to supporting students with a visual impairment. Each year, the RNIB publish evidence-based reviews on young people and older people, varying age groups across the UK, which look at the experiences of people with a visual impairment. So they include a profile of that particular age group, the policies that govern and impact upon their lives, and a commentary on what that evidence tells us. So I've included a website link to that document. The RNIB is also taking part at the moment in a joint project that aims to establish a UK-wide specialist visual impairment curriculum framework. It's for children and young people with vision impairment, obviously, and the VI curriculum framework is going to be designed to sit alongside the academic curriculum, which all children are entitled to. So it's going to be accompanied by the development of an online resource hub, and that will support the sharing of professional resources that are used by qualified teachers of children with vision impairment, and they're known as QT VIs. All schools will have access to one. And it'll also include resources from habilitation specialists across the sector. So that development started just in September of 2020, so very recent, and the curriculum should be ready by September 2022. So for children and young people in your schools who have a visual impairment, the specialist practical support that they'll typically require is quite an extensive list, and it's very bespoke to the individual. But in general, it will include things like regular input from a qualified teacher of learners with VI, QTVI, and that could be for direct teaching of specialist skills like how to read Braille or how to use certain softwares, learning to read and write through those non-standard methods. But they will also give advisory work as well, and they can act as your consultants. They may also need adult support, which will include the use of a teaching assistant who may be trained specifically by the QTVI. They'll need specialist equipment and access technology, and an ongoing adaptation of learning resources and exams as well. They'll need mobility training and independent skills, which will include daily living activities, and this is known as habilitation. They'll need consistent access to low vision assessments and prescription of aids, what strength magnifier they might need, for example. They'll also need support for social emotional development, as they can get quite lost. And they'll also need to be support for their parents and carers as well in their development and learning of their child. So this specialist support should be available via every local authority in the country, but the provision does vary, unfortunately. So the key professionals involved will be a QTVI teacher and a registered qualified habilitation specialist, RQHS. I called mine a mobility officer, and then along with a one-to-one TA and some other health professionals. So QTVI's role includes managing referrals from health into the education sector. They'll provide direct support, and they can also do some assessments on children's functional vision, and they'll liaise with health professionals that are involved with that young person, and they advise in mainstream and specialist settings on areas such as the curriculum and access to it, independent learning, social inclusion, and they'll guide the work of other professionals such as teaching assistants and teachers as well. As well as that, they'll be teaching these specialist skills alongside the child, and they'll be helping develop the visual and communication skills of those with additional or complex needs. They will also support students through their transitions post-16 into further education and into independent adulthood. So the QTVI is going to be involved with the young person for a substantial amount of their young life. The role of the mobility officer, or the RQHS, will be to teach the young person about moving around independently. So that's probably going to be how to use a white cane and how to orientate themselves. And it will also be life tasks as well, you know, getting dressed and finding things around the home. So their independence needs will be assessed by the mobility officer, and they'll work in partnership then with the QTVI. So the professionals are there, use them. They may only visit school once in a blue moon, and some visit more often. It can be weekly, monthly, half-termly, but they are contactable outside of their time. So my advice is just use them as much as you possibly can, and don't be afraid to just ask a million questions. When I was a Senko, I always would phone up, and they were so helpful. So we're going to have a look at the classroom environment now, because this can have a significant impact on the success of teaching and learning. And on top of dealing with these core health and safety issues that the environment brings, it's also important to consider the sensory nature of your environment as well. So you can take a walk around school either as a school team, or you may want to use the support of your QTVI. And you'd just be looking at things in that environment. So walk around and look for general areas where adaptations could be made to make your school environment more accessible for a learner with vision impairment. Some of the features you may observe or consider could include signage around school. And I did this quite recently, actually, with my son's head teacher, who asked me to go in and have a look at the environment with her. So clear signs, well positioned, easily visible. You might put symbols or braille on them if needed, but that's usually specialist. Steps, edges, other key transition points could be painted with yellow paint. There could be handrails to help with mobility. And you might have some tactile trails in school, which are dado rails or other rails that are made of textured material at hand height. And learners can hold on to those and follow them around the school to a particular location. So you might have one going to the toilet or going to the dining hall. Some schools consider different floor coverings as well that demarcates different areas of the school to indicate a change in the environment. And clear panels on doors are important as well, so that people can be seen approaching from the other side. You might also have a bit of a distinction marked between quieter areas of a playground or the more active areas, and also the shaded areas. They're really important for learners with any kind of light sensitivity. You may wish to consider, if you've got school garden, making it a bit more sensory. And maintaining the grounds as well, so there's not obstructions. So corridors, cloakrooms and classrooms need to be kept free of obstructions and things on the floor. You can also consider if frequently used resources are kept in the same accessible place and labelled. This was one of the very first things I was taught to do when I lost my sight. Try and structure not just my workspace but my home as well, and keep things in the same place. That could be personal care, it could be, you know, tins in the cupboard, because one of the biggest things people with sight loss rely on is this like mental map of where everything is. So if something gets moved, it's frustrating. And it can also cause a bit of anxiety as well because you haven't got your eyes to try and find it again. Consider if the level of lighting is right as well for your learner. There'll be something in the paperwork about adjustments. Many can't tolerate bright light. I was one of them. My eyes would stream with water. So they may need to wear hats or sunglasses, which, not just in summer. It may be that they need those all the time, even if they are indoors. Are they sitting close to a power source? Because many will be using accessible IT devices, laptops or specialist speech software. In the paperwork, you'll also know what their effective distance vision is. So this is like, for example, the distance at which they're going to be able to see the board from. So that's important to consider. And also using real objects in your teaching. It's really important to use concrete materials and these hands-on experiences whenever possible to make that learning come alive. Add more talk-based activities to the classroom as well, so there's less reading and writing going on. And you can get tactile aids for loads of different subjects. Have you allowed adequate space for specialist equipment or large print resources? I know with some of my books, they would take up copious amounts of space. So in terms of accessible resources for students who have a visual impairment, it's really important that we strengthen their learning. So therefore, learning materials need to be interesting enough to them to engage them. So consider the use of time for the student, but for you as well, as supporting staff members. Visually impaired learners will often require extra time to process information because they can't see it. It's going to take longer to read and for it to go in. They'll take longer to complete tasks. So even using the simplest formats can help them. So make sure you and any support staff have got the time to modify materials to include certain things. So it could be larger print or it could be bolder colours. Students with a visual impairment will have been assessed and there will be recommendations in place for what strength magnifier they need, what colour paper they need, what size and style of font they can manage to read. You might want to provide a print copy, but a digital copy as well. That can be useful. They can be further adapted to the student to suit them if needed, and the students can often adapt them themselves. And you could consider as an easy option just producing all your materials for learners that are in an accessible font, which would be at least size 14, usually Arial typeface, because this will reduce the amount of modification you need to make, but it's also going to help all your learners, those with dyslexia, for example, or specific learning difficulties. And as always, there will be times when you don't have time to modify things. So look out for pre-created things. There's lots on the internet. There's a wide range of braille materials, audio-visual resources, tactile pictures and diagrams, and they're available from lots of different educational suppliers. Just a note on diagrams and images. They are pretty hard to learn how to use. There are ways around it, but just try and think if the information could be represented as text instead. If you do provide work for students that does contain images like photographs, you can use a feature, you may or may not have heard of it, called alt text, and that enables the person's software to describe the picture to them, and all you do is type in a description of that picture. So it's quite simple to add a description to an image, and you'll be able to find out easily how to do that by Googling it. I've included a link to an article on alt text in the web links as well. And if you're a Twitter user, you can also add alt text to images that you post using Twitter settings. One brilliant service that you can sign up to, you can Google this, is RNIB Bookshare UK. I've put a link in the web links. It's free to any organisation in the UK, and all you have to do is sign up. And what they do is provide accessible textbooks and resources for learners with sight loss, but not just sight loss, dyslexia, dyspraxia and autism, amongst others. And the titles can be downloaded by you or on behalf of learners, and then they can read them electronically or adapt them into whatever format they need, whether it's a Word document or a specialist program like Daisy, or even audio. So the service is available to learners and their parents as well through your school gaining membership. You might also want to sign up to Clear Vision UK. and that's a postal lending library. They have over, I think it's about 13,000 mainstream children's books now. And the books all have added braille or moon, which is a simpler form of braille that younger children use, print and pictures, making them suitable for visually impaired and sighted children and adults to share together. So in the web links, I've also put a link for clear vision as well. Also in the links, I've included a booklet, which will take me way too long to go through today, but it talks about resources for different subjects in school and where you can get accessible resources, but also where you can make some of your already existing sources accessible to someone with a visual impairment. So I'd really recommend having a read through that. One example, the subjects are all split up. So in science, for example, it recommends marking the tops of beakers with yellow tape, so that will avoid spillages. You can use a Stanley knife or a scalpel to mark notches in syringes with plungers so that those little marks can be felt. And because adapting resources is relevant to both students and staff, that booklet will be helpful for both. So I'm moving on now to talk about access technology, which is incredible, and it has enormous potential for supporting learners with a visual impairment and staff across different ages and abilities. It's taken off so much just in the years that I've known about it, and it's come on so much since I was using it. So audio-visual devices or software allow the students to work at their own pace. They will receive training, so you don't need to worry about the technology side of things, and it will enable them to just work independently. But it isn't a magic wand though, and to be a success, it's going to require the right device for the learner or member of staff, the right training and time as well to learn it. And when that's achieved, students can just take control of their own learning journey, and this will not only improve their academic progress, but it will just improve their confidence as well in learning and in the wider world, because they're not having to rely on somebody else to help them all the time. So just some tips then as we start nearing the end of this section, but always use the student's name first when addressing them. This way they'll know you're talking to them and not someone else. When passing them in a corridor, for example, instead of just saying hi, just announce your name, as the student might not be able to recognise your face from the distance they're at. So if you're passing them in the corridor, an example might just be, "Hi Sarah, it's Mrs. Murphy, how are you today?" And prompt students to do the same, because this fosters that social connection in the school community. Often learners with a visual impairment can feel very left out because they can't get that eye contact and that facial recognition that you need to start interactions. So as a teacher, if you're like me, you will naturally gesture, but when you do that, verbalise what you're gesturing. When you're writing on the board, talk and just speak what you're writing as well, so that the student can follow along. And when you're talking about where things are, use positional and directional concepts like above and under and behind, in front of, left and right. It sounds really obvious, but it doesn't always happen. So, the pencil sharpener is on the right of the door on top of the unit, rather than just saying the pencil sharpener's over there. So here, there and over there are the kinds of things to avoid. It's one of my husband's bugbears when people say over there to him, and he always goes, "Where's over there?" Because he doesn't know, he can't see somebody pointing and where they're pointing to. And your students probably won't be able to see that either. Your students also won't be able to spot facial gestures from where they're sitting, so you might need to verbalise your facial expression, which will not only help a visually impaired student, but it would help an autistic student as well. Think about your seating. Always favour the stronger side of the student's vision. For example, if the student only uses their left eye, they would need to sit on the right-hand side of the classroom and away from the windows. So light sources play havoc. So, the windows and any form of light should ideally be at the back of the student or at the side at the very least. The student may need to be seated near the power source for any equipment that they need to plug in. And sloping desks can be something that's quite helpful because they tilt up towards the eyes rather than getting the glare of the light straight down onto a piece of paper. The next thing is contrast. Use it for everything, Think big, bold, simple. Around school in subjects like PE, just make sure the balls are completely different colour to the whole floor. Stairs should have, at the very least, the first and last steps taped with a contrasting colour, which is usually yellow on the edges. When measuring quantities of water, which is really, really hard to see in a beaker, if it's not going to affect a science experiment, add some red or blue food colour into the water, just makes it more visible. And then one of the biggest areas you're going to be adapting resources in is print, obviously, because that's at the bottom of all our teaching and learning. So generally, the less configurations on a page, the better. So worksheets can be cut into strips and then stapled together, so there's less on a page. With your formatting and justification, avoid any fancy script and italic type writing. Avoid underlining and always left justify the text. It just makes it easier to find on the page. Screen readers will also read better if it's left justified. And always remember that lowercase letters are much easier to read than capitals, because lowercase letters have ascenders and descenders, and that just makes them more visually distinctive by shape. All your print materials need to be clear and dark, so you can darken them up a notch or two on the photocopier or on the printer, and have lined paper for all assignments, and the darker the better. I used to take lined paper and draw on the lines with a ruler with a dark black pen, and I'd photocopy lots and lots and lots of sheets of that. With the whiteboard, always try and use black pens, never green. It's the hardest colour to see, especially on a white background. And generally, it's recommended to use black on white or black on yellow. So if you've ever been in an eye hospital, which I have many times, you'll notice that all the signage is bold black writing on a bright yellow background. And that's just because it's what most visually impaired people prefer and can still see, even when they're losing their sight. But that won't be true for everybody. For some people as well, black on white can be too much glare. So you can put a filter on your whiteboard, like a cream filter, or use a buff paper instead. Only really use colours if it's been specifically recommended for someone, because they are harder to see. You might also want to consider fatigue and visual fatigue as well. So do your best to encourage the student to use whatever visual aids and resources they've been prescribed, and whether that's glasses or magnifiers or big print. They might not like using them, but it is going to help with visual fatigue. Any of the near work should be limited to 15 minutes or less. So 15 minutes break. So they can be encouraged to look away from their desk. You might want to send them to sharpen their pencil or just do another little activity, as this will allow them to refocus their eyes so that they're less likely to become visually fatigued. Also have them remember the rule, elbow to fingers. Okay, so measure elbow to fingers and remind them that they need never get closer to their work than that distance. If they are having to get closer, it's likely that something needs to be changed or amended. Require them to copy less from the board or elsewhere. That can be quite difficult, and also allow more time to complete tasks and provide breaks. Try and reduce the glare in class from anything around, such as desks or displays and the whiteboard. You may use them already, but you can get matte laminating pouches for your displays, which will reduce glare. And always turn screens off when they're not in use and keep the blinds closed. And socially, as I mentioned before, a lot of students can feel a bit left out. So have other students act as buddies and use peer tutoring and peer groups as much as possible to include and support them. I know for me, when I lost my sight, the social side of it was probably the most difficult. And I always think that, you know, children and young people respond really well to their peers helping them more so than us as adults. So now I'm going to be talking about supporting staff in school with a visual impairment, and a lot of this is going to come from my own personal experience. So when I had my eye operation, my first one, I was absent for 6 months while I was waiting for my eye to heal. And during that time, the local authority arranged for me to visit a visual rehabilitation centre, where I was taught how to use the software I'd need, how to touch type, train using a white cane for mobility, and access all kinds of other life skills and independence training. So once my eye was okay and I had some quite blurry vision back, I was ready to go back to work, back to teaching. So prior to this, the RNIB visited my workplace, spoke to me, my social worker and my mobility officer, and they did a full assessment of my needs. And they listed the skills and the equipment that I was going to need to be able to return to work. There's also an incredible government scheme, which you may have heard of, called Access to Work, which helps any person with a disability remain or go into employment. And they provided my specialist equipment, the funding for it, as well as the funding for taxi transport to get me to and from school. And they also funded a full-time personal assistant who would be my eyes when I needed her. So my head teacher was really keen to support me. He came along to some of the assessments. He put in extra PPA time for me because planning and marking were going to take me forever. And believe me, they absolutely did. So when I was about to go back to work, I was quite positive and I was quite full of hope. And I was determined that I could definitely do it. I'd already decided to let go of the Senko role for a while, as I knew I wouldn't be able to just manage that amount of paperwork. So I was going back as a classroom teacher. However, I'd always been a Key Stage 2 teacher. And during the time I was off, the senior leadership team had had a reshuffle and there'd been some redundancies as well. We'd lost some, really important, crucial, lovely members of staff. So at this time, my supportive head teacher had also gone on long-term sick. So it wasn't the best start. So when I was actually going back, I'd found out I'd been moved to year 1. And this was going to be run as an early years type classroom, very similar setup to foundation stage with all the areas. So you can imagine how concerned I was in terms of health and safety, because there's so many obstacles in an early years classroom, plus lots of little people to trip over. And I was also worried because I've been in year 3 for 2 years, so I knew it like the back of my hand. And I thought, I'll have less planning to do. So the RNIB strongly recommended that I be put back in my old classroom, which I was familiar with and which I knew, but this didn't happen. I also had very little TA support for the children, and part of that was because of the fact I had an extra adult in class with me, and it was seen that this extra adult could almost be a TA. However, it's really important to note that when Access to Work provides a personal assistant, who's been funded through them, and they are there to support the member of staff. So she was there for me and not the pupils. At times I could use it for the pupils, and I did. So with a new class in a new room, and even with all this amazing equipment and support I had, I was working every night until late and most weekends as well. And I had the most dreadful headaches from straining to make my eyes try and see the laptop screen just so that I could get my work done and work a bit faster. And in terms of other adjustments, I needed all my documents in a size 24 font. I needed them on a certain colour of paper. And staff would forget this just didn't happen. So I found myself lost an awful lot of times, not knowing what was going on around me in staff meetings, not knowing what was happening in training. And things did eventually get better and I was able to manage, but I absolutely can't tell you how difficult that time was. And I was saved only by the fact that I knew I was getting my sight back. So I've talked about the practical ways in which I struggled, but it's also important to be aware that if there are staff in your school who have some sort of sight loss or anything else going on, they're also going to be affected socially, emotionally. And the social side of it for me and the emotional side was just bigger than anything else. And I've spoken in a lot of detail about that in the interview with Dr. Pookie Knight-Smith, which I mentioned before, and it's in the web links as well. So that gives you a bit of a more in-depth insight into the emotional stuff that was going on. So lots of the considerations I've mentioned earlier when I was talking about students, such as accessible resources and modifying equipment and the school environment itself, they are all applicable to staff with a visual impairment as well. But there's also a couple of extra things to consider that I thought I'd talk about specifically. So firstly, the absolute best thing you could ever do as a member of staff or as a member of the senior leadership team is to let that member of staff know that you fully support them and that your door is always open for them. To listen to what they're struggling with and just find that way together, work together to find the way around it. This is the most important thing that you can do for someone, in my opinion. And if the staff member would find it helpful, you might want to arrange for another member of staff to be their go-to person. And they can also be a bit of a wellbeing mentor, a bit of a coach as well. Someone who's compassionate, someone who has like a strong ability to empathise. Because often when we're really struggling, we just need somebody to listen, don't we? We don't need a magic wand. Visually impaired members of staff will have been assessed, just like any student will be, and there'll be recommendations for them. So it's important that everyone in school that comes into contact with that member of staff knows what their specific needs and arrangements are, and that might include a specific font size, a certain colour for paper documents. It might be software that needs to be in place, which will already be provided. You don't have to do that as a school. It may be that they need flexible working hours as well. And just make sure to ask the member of staff about the disability. Myself and my husband, we were never offended. We always welcome the fact that some people would ask how they could best support us, rather than assuming how to do it. It's best if visually impaired staff also have just the one base to work in, rather than having to move around school or move around classrooms, because this way they can just store all their things how they need to store them, and they'll always know where everything is. We need that mental map of where all our things are. If you're in a primary school and you are thinking of moving staff around, which does happen, always involve the visually impaired member of staff and don't make the decision for them, and check what they think they'll be able to manage. I was always happy to change year groups now and again, but I was actually able to stay in the same classroom to make things easier for me. And it also saved traipsing all over school with lots and lots of equipment. Bear in mind that visually impaired staff will need additional time, and they'll need the additional time for planning, for preparation, for marking and for assessments. And if something needs to be done last minute, they will find this difficult, and it can cause a lot of anxiety and worry. So just bear in mind that things are going to be a little harder and they're going to take a little longer for someone with a disability. So just give them that extra time or the resources that they're going to need. If you're going to have staff training, for example, in school, if it's in-house, that'll be fine. If you've got someone coming in, ask them if you can have the training PowerPoint or any resources beforehand, and you can give them to that member of staff with a visual impairment before the training takes place, even if it's just the day before, because they'll be able to go through them beforehand if they need to read them with magnifiers, or they might want to transfer them onto their computer or another accessible aid before the training takes place. If the member of staff has a guide dog and they're going to be bringing their guide dog to school, guide dogs will work really closely with the workplace to make recommendations and support both the employer and the employee with having a dog. And then lastly, you may wish to consider whole staff visual awareness training, because that's not going to only benefit the member of staff in your school with a visual impairment, but it's going to benefit all the students you support and the families who may have a visual impairment as well. Even now, I feel visual impairment isn't addressed as much as other special educational needs, and there's some really amazing training out there where you can virtually experience sight loss and see what it's actually like. And before we move on to just talking about how to support family members with a visual impairment next, I just want to finish this part by just acknowledging my 2 organ donors who provided me with my new corneas, because they gave me my sight back and they gave me my life back. I do think of them always, and I'm privileged to have them both as part of me. For this part of the talk, I'm going to be talking about supporting visually impaired families. I've brought along my husband's guide dog with me because he's going to be featuring towards the end of this talk. And they say never work with children or animals, don't they? But I already work with children, so I'm sure we'll be fine, won't we? So, families. There's so many events to consider for a family, or a parent, a carer, any other family member has some sort of visual impairment. In my own situation, because my husband can't see, but I am sighted now, it possibly makes our situation a little bit easier for him. However, if I'm at work or I can't be there, there are times when he has to attend school events alone because, he hasn't got anybody to go with him. So there's also the issue of independence as well. Many people with a visual impairment do want to be as independent as possible, and they don't want to be relying on other people to do things for them or to accompany them anywhere. If they've got a dog like Kane, they can pretty much go anywhere they need to. So I'm just going to talk through some considerations and ways that you can help as a school. So firstly, punctuality. As those with a visual impairment can't drive, obviously, they are often at the mercy of public transport. So when a visually impaired person is waiting at a bus stop, all buses are supposed to stop for them. The driver should open the door and ask them what bus they're waiting for. And if it's theirs, obviously they get on. And the bus driver would then ask what stop they need. And they would then shout the stop to the person when they arrive. However, that doesn't always go to plan. So there have been times for us where the bus just flies past my husband at the bus stop and doesn't stop. The bus can be late, or he'll be on the bus and the driver forgets to shout the stop, which means my husband has to get off at the next one and then walk all the way back again. So at times our son's been late for school, or my husband has been late for picking him up. So as a school, you may decide that you're going to waive late marks if you keep those in the register for the children of parents with a visual impairment or carers or other family members, and make sure that there is a safe place for them to wait after school until their family member can get there at no extra charge. Lateness causes such a huge amount of anxiety, both for the family member and the child. And then picking up very young children, you know the deal. The reception doors open, the children fly out, family member gives a quick wave and the child goes to them. Well, a visually impaired person won't be able to do this, and they won't know when their child has come out of the door. So it might be helpful for a member of staff, if the child is very young, to take them over and just do that physical handover to the family member. At this time, obviously, social distancing would have to be applied. Or you could arrange for them to stand in the same place every day, and that would just make it easier for everyone to spot them. So school performances is something else that I just wanted to mention. Often family members queue, don't they? And then everybody rushes into the hall to grab a seat to watch the performance. And considering that some people with a visual impairment may be able to see that performance if they can be seated at the front, you might want to consider possibly reserving a seat for them and whoever's with them. If they have a guide dog like Kane, they will need a seat on the end of the row so that there's enough space for them and for the dog to sit. And just to bear in mind that if the lights are going to go off and the aisles are going to be used in your performance, just ensure that everyone's aware where the dog is. And there have been times when Kane's been in the theatre, for example, and he's got stood on because it goes very dark and you can't see down the aisles. You might also want to pre-warn a guide dog owner if there are going to be any bangs or loud noises during the performance. Most dogs won't flinch, as that's part of their training to ignore those kinds of sounds, but it's best to still say, for my husband, he personally prefers it if school set aside 2 seats at the front that are away from the rest of the audience. And this is normally due to the fact that I'll be with him, but I'll often be leaning over to him and describing what's going on. And he gets quite conscious of, other people hearing me whispering to him about the performance and what's happening, and that it might spoil their experience. So that's his personal preference, but I would just ask. Homeschool communication is another thing to think about. Ask visually impaired family members how they'd prefer communication from school. Most will be happy with the electronic systems that most schools use, as they'll probably have software on their phones to read this. However, if it's an older grandparent, for example, they might not use the technology. Some people as well still prefer print, in which case you need to check on the size. Some parents or carers or families might prefer a call or an audio file sent to them. And bear in mind that if the message is last minute, you may need to make a phone call, because the visually impaired person might not be at home, and home is where they normally have access to their equipment. School reports are really important as well, so it's also worth checking what format the person would like those to be in. Parents' evenings are another thing I was going to talk about today. Really important. I look forward to going to them, and so does my husband. So, if a visually impaired person is attending a parents' evening alone, remember that they won't be able to see you when you call them for their appointment. So, the best thing is probably just to approach them, say their name, and then guide them to where they're going to be sat. You may have guided people before, but if you haven't, if you're guiding a person that does not have a guide dog, all you do is put your arm out, offer your elbow, and they will take hold of your elbow, not your hand, and you just walk a pace in front. Describe everything as you're going along, such as we're going through a door, we're just going left, we're just going to walk forwards. If you slide your hand down my arm, this is the back of your chair, and then they'll sit down. If you're going to go through a narrow opening, such as a doorway, such as a classroom doorway, just tuck your arm behind your back and the person will still hold your elbow and they'll move behind you. If the person does have a guide dog, there's no need to guide them. The dog will do it for you and they'll just follow wherever their owner goes. And my favourite thing at parents' evenings is looking through our child's books. But of course, my husband never gets to do that and he doesn't get to share it with me. So it's often me looking through the books and telling him what's in there, but it's not the same as seeing it himself. So one thing you might want to consider is allowing the family member to take their child's books home on parents' evening. They will be able to take them home and place them under any of their equipment. So they may have a magnifier and they can put the book under and it will magnify it on a big screen. And then they are able to look at the books themselves and they can just return them to school the next day for you. So a note on guide dogs now, which is why I brought Kane with me, who's lying down now. But there's like 3 levels of dog. When he's not wearing anything at all, he's your normal bouncy pet dog. When he's on a lead, he's kind of half working, and a lot of his attention will be on the person holding the lead, but he's still able to stray. He will still be distracted as well. With his harness on, he will be totally fixated on his owner, and he will most likely ignore anyone who comes up to try and stroke him, and he might actually look a bit uncomfortable. On the harness, I've brought Kane's with me. You can see as soon as I picked it up, he's moved because he knows. But on the harness, it actually says, please don't distract me, I'm a working guide dog. And it's really important we don't do that when he's wearing this harness because we don't want to undo any of his special training that he's had. He knows that when he's got this on, he has to be 100% focused on his owner at all times because in public, the owner's life is in his hands. When they're in dangerous situations or they're crossing roads, he's the one that he's going to be relying on. So it's absolutely fine to stroke a guide dog, but always ask the owner first, in which case the owner will take this harness off. And it may also be worth explaining to the other pupils that they mustn't try to distract him or stroke him when he's got this harness on. If you'd like to know more about guide dogs in particular and spread that awareness across school for students and staff, you can contact your local branch of guide dogs, and either they or a guide dog owner with guide dog's permission will come into school and do a talk for you. So as we reach the end of this talk, I'd just like to remind you of the web links that I've mentioned throughout. If you need any help, you're free to email me. I don't mind that at all. It's kate.holden@togethertrust.org.uk, or you can find me on Twitter where I'm known as Kate Holden ASC. So I'd just like to say thank you for listening, but also thank you for everything you do to support the visually impaired people in either your professional role or as a family member. You will be making such a difference.
Hey, it's Ian here at Studio TV. Thank you so much for joining us here at Getting It Right for Me Live. Let me ask you a really quick question. Are you here because you are hoping to develop your skills and your knowledge and all your learning and understanding around supporting and caring for children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities? I assume that's what you've come here for. We hope that you're enjoying your time here with us. There's some amazing people and we're so grateful for them coming and being part of this. And we're so grateful for you to be joining us as well. There's a couple of things I just really quickly wanted to introduce you to. First of all, don't forget that you can upgrade your ticket at any time to one of the paid tickets, which we try to keep the price as low as we possibly can, just to cover what we need to, help out the speakers a little bit, and make sure this event is as good as it can be. What that means is you can access the live Q&A sessions that we're running throughout the event, and you can access all the sessions for up to a year afterwards if you buy one of those paid tickets. Check out the whole school ones. How that works is if you book a whole school ticket, and you can pay online, or you can drop us a line and we'll issue an invoice and we'll sort it all out. That's absolutely fine. But we'll then make it possible for all your staff to be able to access all the sessions here at Getting It Right for Me Live this year. So do hope that's helpful. The other thing I want to mention is, and there are lots of members joining us this week, so thank you so much to those of you who are members, but we have put together, if you're looking to go deeper and access ongoing support and help and training, either as an individual, as a parent, as a professional supporting someone with additional needs, in a school or educational setting, or from a professional point of view, we have put together here at Scudio TV with Lynn McCann and her team at Reach Out ASC a fantastic membership that starts at just £10 a month and includes a wide range of courses to help you support those in your care. There's a load of resources and tools, printable things that you can use to work with those children and support them. And there's more content being added all the time. One of my favorite parts of the membership is there is a peer group community that's built into that. So you can ask questions of Lynn and her team and your peers built right into that membership as well. As I say, it starts at just £10 a month. Whole school memberships are there. We're offering trust-wide memberships, and local authorities have started to get in touch and offer this to their staff across a range of schools as well. We would love for you to join our community. If you've got any questions on that, drop us a line, but very much hope to see you there. And thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the day.